Thank you, Karan Patala. Chief, esteemed guests, it's an honor to be here today. Also, thank you to the organizational committee. Actually, it's very interesting, like even the sequence of the discussion, it's complementary. We just heard from Lieutenant General De Tula a little bit of the overview for the future geopolitically, but some of the tough questions taking place right now, the debate in DC for policy decisions coming forward. Also, what needs to take place in order to produce the right decisions in very tough spots all over the world, but most likely in the East, the challenges we are facing are emerging and tough questions are necessary to be asked. So if you take that part and combine it with what Professor Olsen was saying about the contest of ideas to be able to address the future of air superiority, that's where I come in. Essentially, a big part of the work that we have been doing at the university is studying conflict from the personal level, the organizational level, and also the more macro geopolitical level. I'm lucky enough to have been raised in an air base. My father was an F-4 Phantom pilot. I'm in touch on a daily basis with mid-career personnel, both from the Air Force. Also, having myself spent 10 years as a Greek officer, I have the input of the Greek the Navy mid-career officers as well. So what I would try to do is share some of the perspective of what I have experienced as a practitioner, not academic, as a practitioner studying conflict over the past 12 years, with what I'm sensing from the mid-level personnel that will be called to actually participate in the operations, and I would argue need to be more included in the debate that is currently taking place. So while you'll be hearing tomorrow, for example, more about the hard stuff of the technology, where it's going, I will be talking about the soft stuff, the cultural stuff, what is actually required in order to achieve the superiority technologically that we have seen so far. And towards the end of my discussion, we'll be specifically focusing about the difference between the American way, the Western way of dealing with problems versus how Russia and China are dealing with it. So to follow my train of thought, I will just try to share a little bit of what you expect from my discussion, so it's easier to follow what I'm saying. In the beginning, I want to redefine conflict a little bit. What is conflict? How do I view it? How will I be using the terminology of conflict in a different way that we're used to? Then discuss a little bit about how we are experiencing this breakdown of silos, this interoperability, this systems thinking of how different teams need to come together to work. And that happens in multiple levels, not just in the military, exactly the same transition from one hero to a team being able to deliver victory it's a major breakthrough, but it's also a cultural breakthrough. So we'll be discussing a little bit about that as well. So how do we institutionalize this culture of being able to bring teams together to produce great products, innovation, being able to share ideas so they get closer to the truth? We will discuss this mostly with real-life examples. Like this will be something that I really love talking specifically here in Greece, which is how in the US there's this radical obsession almost with transparency, asking the tough questions, and being able to actually, through tough, productive conflict, get closer to the truth, improve our systems. The US has been leading in terms of whistleblower programs, of having very difficult discussions as a culture, and we have been actually receiving dividends from that as recipients of that technology. And finally, I will try to connect this with how this perspective of being able to appreciate this productive debate is a competitive advantage over the challenges that we're facing in the East. So first of all, let's redefine conflict. Most of us, when we think of conflict, we have very negative connotations in our head. We think of very negative pictures. And I'm talking about conflict on a personal level, on an organizational level. So I would like to challenge that and say, okay, apart from the destructive kind of conflict that most of us think when we think of the word conflict, which is essentially opening Pandora's box. If it's not managed well, it's like opening a can of worms. What I would like to focus more on is the productive part of conflict, which is the holy grail for so many of the things that we need in order to have this competitive advantage over the challenges that we're facing. So the first part, which is the destructive part of conflict, that needs to be managed effectively. There are individual costs that are very significant, both on an organizational setting and in a military setting. First of all, we have time wasted, we have effort that's being multiplied, stress for the users and the participants in different organizations, reduction in performance, et cetera, et cetera. Having gone through a Greek military academy, our conflict management styles are not usually invested in, and I think this is something that could be easily improved as a culture inside our systems. At the same time, this has organizational costs, how in the future more departments will be working together, Navy and the Air Force. We will see some of those examples. They don't speak the same language. Now in the future, with what the new purchases have been bringing into our system in Greece, the Navy and the Greek Air Force need to figure out a way to communicate differently, need to be able to have better communications, not just on the technological level, but as a culture, as a mentality. They need to increase their interoperability, and we will discuss a little bit more. A big part of that as well has to do with the retention of talent, meaning not managing conflict well is affecting mid-career personnel who are now very well trained, they have alternatives, they're difficult to retain in the workforce, so it's very important to inspire this younger generation coming up the chain. So let's talk about productive conflict a bit more. So productive conflict, which is most of my discussion today, is essentially the holy grail to be able to harness its power for innovation, for joint decision-making, for creative problem-solving, for insightful strategic thinking. And if you speak to young mid-career officers, one of the challenges that they often experience is that some of their experience on the ground, some of their insights, some of the most nuances that they have every single day based on the experience from the field often is not passed along up the leadership command in order to be included in the decision-making. Being able to bring them in, harness the power of their inclusion, it's a major competitive advantage, especially given how, and we will see this towards the end of the discussion, Russia has a very different approach to this, and this is backfiring, especially in Ukraine. So conflict overall is studied in multiple levels. First, we have, even before this, we have even with ourselves. Like, for example, conflict with ourselves would be having the courage to speak up when you need to speak up. Now, the Air Force is lucky enough of being very upfront with having courage to speak up in difficult situations. Why? Because you have safety. Air safety is above everything. So every single member of the Air Force family feels the obligation and stirs up the courage to have conflict if it comes to air safety. But then there are multiple levels of conflict, for example, with one another, within the organization, and every single one of those levels with other units and with other departments, with the Navy, for example, as I mentioned before, there's a culture that starts superseding the procedures that we need to be able to embrace as we need to go forward more technologically and be more competitive with the modern challenges. So one of the things that is like the foundation for continuous loop learning, for continuous learning in general, and this is a social psychology model, is based on the conflict that the system can have or individual can have with themselves in order to learn from the mistakes, essentially. So what this looks like usually is we start with assumptions, what we do. Often we neglect that. We jump to the mid part, which is what we actually do. There are some techniques, some strategies. We get the results that we get, and most of us, especially in more civilian setting, let's say, we go from the results to single loop learning back to just changing what we do. What is really powerful is once someone, an organization, an individual, embraces the power of double loop learning, meaning instead of changing what we do, we need to just look beyond fixing the problem, look in actually the root causes, asking the whys of how did we end up here in order to challenge our assumptions. So this is a very basic social psychology perspective over asking the tough questions to keep improving a system, a procedure, someone's perspective. And when I first came across this, it reminded me something that was familiar for me from my older previous military life, which is John Boyd's OODA loop. Essentially, they're complementary because so many different people have been approaching this double loop learning. However, in our daily lives, we need to sort of bring in this perspective in a more practical way. So what is the OODA loop in this specific case? You have the first part, which are the observations. then that feeds into the orientation, being able to just orient yourself by whatever filters you have inherently. And one big part of it that I want to highlight is the cultural traditions. What is the software we have inside and how that affects our perspective. Then we go to the decision part, act part, but the most important thing, the critical part, is the feedback part. Is the part that we need to be able to have, to ask the tough questions, to be able to revisit our assumptions and be able to be more effective with our next decision making. So this specific approach of being able to challenge our assumptions, challenge ourselves, being able to improve our systems is a necessity. It's not just a luxury. It's a necessity because we are experiencing something that's pretty historic. Not now, it's over the past 10, 15, 20 years. So far, like during human progression in organizational settings, we have been focusing mostly on vertical specialization. That happens in academia, in science, in business, in military. It has been happening for a long time. But over the past couple of decades, mostly the decade, now increasingly more going forward, we are investing more in horizontal collaboration. Why? Because we know our limitations, we understand more our limitations, and we understand how horizontal collaboration is a necessity. However, breaking down silos requires conflict, requires productive conflict. The whole idea of interoperability that I was raised hearing in the Naval Academy, the whole idea of the network-centric warfare makes it even more specific for what Greece is about to face over the next few years. More specifically, we have the Rafales, we have the Belara. The previous, actually, chief of the Navy and his team, I had a discussion with them a few months ago when they went to the Naval Group to observe the beginning of the construction of the Belara frigates. When they came back, the first thing they told me, well, actually, the person who was in charge of maintaining a little bit, keeping track of the procedure at that point, what he said is, we are going to change completely. We have to change completely the way that we approach air control over the Aegean. The Navy alone, there's no way we can deal with this challenge. There's no way we can actually exploit to the full potential the abilities of Belara. So we're talking about the new Hellenic Navy and Hellenic Air Force air defense dogma. Air controlling so far, I was an air controller in frigate Hydra for a long time, is very different when it comes to these systems. But in order for this to take place, there needs to be productive conflict between the Greek Navy and the Greek Air Force for them to customize essentially what kind of solution would satisfy the needs that we have in order to maximize the potential and the outcome that we get from these systems. This is a breakthrough that we need to invest more in. Essentially, what we're discussing is this idea of all of us are just blind, touching different parts of the elephant. The elephant, in this case, looking in Greece in Greece's scope, would be that Greece, the Navy, the Greek Navy, Greek Air Force, other components of the greater Greek system are blind when it comes to each other's reality. We are invested in touching just single parts of the elephant and being committed that this is what the elephant looks like. Of course, there are efforts improving this. However, the same thing applies on a much bigger level. Our collective NATO defense has to do with us understanding how we're part of a system and we're touching a different part of the elephant, and we need to embrace this constructive conflict culture to be able to cooperate better. So how do we institutionalize culture? This is the important part, and this is where we're getting closer to a little bit some of the practical examples to see how some of the radical decisions that the US has taken over the past many decades have benefited all of us. First of all, you need top-down commitment to institutionalize this kind of approach, that everyone needs to be empowered when it comes to productive conflict engagement. We need to explore different ways of doing this. We need to invest in a culture also from the academy level and on the base level. There need to be structural changes, attitudinal changes, and transactional changing. Structural changes could be, for example, new departments that are focusing specifically on investigation, on being able to engage through mediation services, personnel on the ground, being able to focus on whistleblower programs that are very foreign for the Greek culture, but the US has benefited immensely from this. Attitudinal changes takes a long time, but still are part of the cultural transition, that once you put in place the right procedures, over time, at least 1 or 2 generations, they become a reality. And the transactional part is just improving the communication part. So because I don't like too much the theory part, I want to just highlight, mostly for the Greek audience, what has really, I would say, inspired me from the US very radical way of approaching transparency. Over the past, I would say, 7, 8 years, I work in DC monitoring databases for federal election spending, for spending in different federal programs, lobbying contracts. There's no other place on the planet when you can find, if anyone ran for office 10, 15 years ago, you can find every single receipt for any donation they received from anyone. At the same time, any kind of procurement that is taking place, you can find the contracts. So this level of commitment has created institutions that are very powerful, and I would argue have benefited also the technological advancements that the US has been able to achieve over the past 50, 70 years. So first of all, one of the most important and interesting, for our case, discussion procedures and departments is the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. They have a dedicated website and a whole department for whistleblower protection. They even have a hotline, meaning if any member of the Department of Defense, at any level, it doesn't matter if you're a soldier, if you're a general, anyone, if you're a civilian personnel, you come across something that has to do with corruption, misappropriation of funds, something that's wasting taxpayer money, there's a whole process and a dedicated team to make sure that you are heard, that you can actually address, and the system addresses the grievances, investigates them, and what's also important, protects whoever had the courage to go ahead to bring this up. So this is an example of institutionalizing a new approach to be able to avoid corruption, address corruption, and also overspending. My most favorite one, and actually very recent because of Afghanistan, is a long program in the Department of State, which they call the Descent Channel. And I want to read this exactly from the the State Department website, which describes what this procedure looks like. So State Department has realized that there's this gap I mentioned before between officers in the field and leadership. And often information from the field is not passed along the decision-making channels, and bad decisions are often made. So they came up with this policy which says that any US citizen employees, foreign and domestic, must be able to express dissenting or alternative views on substantive issues of policy in a manner which ensures serious high-level review and response. The State Department then has the obligation to facilitate this uncensored dialogue, this conflict that's productive, in order to focus on substantive foreign policy issues, and at the end of the day, that's the only way that they can get closer to right, insightful strategic planning. The last part, which is interesting, is how individuals are protected from reprisals. Now, there have been many questions about this program, especially over the past couple of months, especially from Republicans, because during the Afghanistan withdrawal, the descent channel of foreign officers from Afghanistan, US officers in Afghanistan, was producing a lot of feedback about how the planning of the withdrawal wasn't going well, it wasn't taking into account very crucial information from the ground. And this is just one of the latest examples of how whistleblowers actually shaped strategic thinking and policy planning in an actual way. By the way, talking about air superiority, air power, one of the most famous whistleblowers in the Department of Defense was more than 10 years ago when 2 of the leading test pilots of F-22 went to 60 Minutes, and they were trying to address some of their concerns that were unheard of at the time about issues with the oxygen supply for officers and how they were, of pilots and how they were blacking out. So this system is very powerful in order to be able to address some of the challenges that are often not being brought up to the attention of the leadership. Another almost checks and balances approach for this is Congress, how Congress is actually investing in this. Most of us here have been following something that I found as being a fascinating paradox. The US has been spending almost half a trillion dollars, $400-something billion in developing the F-35. So the paradox is the most expensive defense program in the recent history of the US, at the same time, is the one that has been most openly, publicly scrutinized. Why is that? That is very specific. The reason for that is that's the only way you go forward. That's the only way that you make sure you don't leave any stone unturned so that you address everything in the making. So one of those approaches is institutionalizing the Government Accountability Office. This is the watchdog of Congress. Essentially, Congress wants to make sure that the money that they approve, that they are appropriately utilized by whoever is using them in the federal government. And it's interesting to see how the US is approaching this by saying that DOA's average return on investment for every single dollar the federal government is spending on the scrutiny that DAO produces, it saves $145, which is insane. So we see this culture of productive conflict, of having someone appreciating that, I know those are tough questions, but I need them, saves, for $1 that you spend on that, you spend $145, which is unfathomable. So I want to, again, I'm not an expert in the F-35s, but this is what I was thinking while I was looking at this. With this kind of approach, with this kind of, these checks and balances, with this level of scrutiny and public conflict, the US, for the past 20 years, has been able to produce more than 1,000 fifth-generation fighter jets operating globally currently, 2 different types, F-22, F-35s. However, where is the equivalent for Russia? They're still struggling to come up with something. Again, it's a multiple-factor question, but one of the things that we are seeing over the past year, and many experts in Russia have been highlighting, is that maybe a big part of the shortcomings of the Russian machine has to do with culture more so than anything. So I want to highlight a couple of points from experts. Essentially, there's a unanimous decision, I think, agreement when it comes to some of the things that have been the shortcomings of Russia in the battlefield over the past year. And discussions, especially with think tankers and people who were experts in Pentagon and then went to think tanks, they still to corroborate what I'm about to say. So one of the major challenges that Russia is facing is corruption, is how the leadership, Putin himself, the generals underneath, didn't have what the US, the benefit that the American way, the Western way, our way, NATO way, benefits from, which is this productive conflict, making sure that we are asking the right questions, there's more transparency, and that we are addressing them before we engage in the field. So systemic corruption in Russia's defense and security sectors are apparent in the battlefield. One of the experts that people often cite, again, there are so many focusing on China for the past few years, but one of them, General Hooper, he highlighted this in multiple times, and I want to actually really focus on this, how, and this is a consensus, how Russian officers in the field keep getting killed because they don't trust their junior subordinates to give them an accurate picture of the battlefield. They're being hounded by Moscow to share what's going on, and they only trust their own judgment. However, not just US military officers, I see that it's the same thing also with the Greek culture, NATO culture, because it transcends, learn to use and trust their own judgment in a rapidly evolving combat situation and explain their actions later on. There's trust in the user. There's trust to whoever is engaged in the field. And they anticipate that the leadership will support their actions, particularly if there is a favorable income. And these types of cultural tenets are not necessarily common to either Russian military culture or Chinese culture. Those types of capabilities are absolutely essential to the success in information warfare, hybrid warfare-based environments. And we see that in Russian military, they simply don't exist. China is the same way. I would say even for us, it's a good thing because we have the same cultural differences with Turkey as well. One of the discussions many discussions with Greek pilots, with Greek submarine officers, captains, they all seem to agree that the flexibility that they're given from leadership in order to be more innovative with the decision-making in the field, it's a major asset, especially in the challenges that we have with Turkey. So, some of the key takeaways, the main 2 things as a cultural takeaway. Embracing productive conflict is a competitive advantage. Transparency, innovation, flexibility, empowerment, quality, lessons learned, system of thought, adaptivity, they all come from being able to embrace a culture of productive conflict. And it's not just a matter of operational readiness and performance. I would argue essentially that all the technological superiority coming out from the West is because of that. Russia and China cannot simply replicate or easily address such a major qualitative disadvantage, given their inherently deeply engraved political and cultural limitations. And again, being a Navy officer myself, I want to highlight that the same thing we observe with Turkey as well, which we need to just invest even more in order to be able to further increase that gap, not only on the equipment section, on the material section, the technological part, but also on the cultural part. At the end of the day, if it can be destroyed by the truth, it deserves to be destroyed by the truth. Thank you for your attention.